Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Welcome to another edition of Illinois Rising. Dan Proft, I'm the Morning Drive co-host of Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, along with Amy Jacobson, 5 to 9 a.m. each morning. And joining me on this edition of Illinois Rising is Pat Hughes, who's the co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project and also the author of 2-Minute Warnings and Dollars and Cents commentaries at upstream-ideas.com. And Pat, the next cataclysmic issue facing the governor and the General Assembly after they decided to induce cataclysm with a massive tax increases and no spending reforms in the budget that was passed with some surrender Republican support and an override of the governor's veto the other week is school funding. K through 12 education was not settled by that override of Governor Rauner's veto. And there's legislation that's called SB 1 that has yet to reach the governor's desk that includes a number of things, including bailout dollars for the city of Chicago schools and pension holidays for Chicago public school system. It's very Chicago-focused, and it is also includes this revised school funding formula, which is, Stephen Hawking couldn't discern it, but a downstate state senator, Democrat Andy Minar, has been pushing a new redistribution of school funding to essentially redistribute more money away from suburban school districts to the city of Chicago and to some downstate school districts. That's included as well with a phony baloney hold harmless provision we'll get into. But this is the next big moment potentially for Governor Rauner and the General Assembly. What are you going to do about K through 12 education? There seems to be a disagreement, particularly on Chicago public school bailout. And if the governor goes to the mat on this, you could be looking at the prospect of at least some of the state schools not opening on time or not being able to stay open very long, sans state support, come next month.
Yeah, it's a political problem for the governor and one he's going to have to figure out and tread lightly on, because although most of the people who are going to vote for his reelection in 2018 and most of the people in the state of Illinois are not going to be in favor of the bailout, they're not for Chicago. They're not going to be in favor of the redistribution that Minar is suggesting. But when schools, Dan, don't open, there's going to be a hue and cry from the unions, from the Democrats, and all of that blame.
And from parents.
And from parents. And all of that blame is going to be focused towards the governor. So if that happens, he has got to be ready, and we'll talk about this later. This week, he's done something that will allow him to be more ready for this than he would have been previously. But it's a political conundrum that we've got to figure out.
For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by State Representative Joe Sosnowski, who's a Republican legislator from the Rockford area. He's also a member of the Elementary and Secondary Education Committee in the Illinois House. Joe, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
So, help us distill this for families throughout the state who are trying to make sense of what politicians are talking about when they mention SB 1 and they talk about school funding and they're arguing about who is or who is not threatening to prevent schools from opening on time this fall.
Sure. Well, only in Chicago-run politics do we all basically just giving more money to Chicago. As you mentioned in your comments leading into this, we have a formula nobody can really understand now, and they've created something that is even more complicated. The only way you actually use it is if you put more money into education. All the old money that we already spend all stays, with the schools, and there's no change there. So in essence, you're not really changing much. You're just finding a new way to send more money to Chicago. And there's a lot of details in it, obviously, as you mentioned. But essentially, Chicago has gamed the system so that they change the formula to benefit themselves, so they get more money on top of it.
So it's really a tough. Yeah, so there's the essentially the bailout piece of Chicago, which is a bankrupt school system financially and in every other way. is having to borrow at Sopranos rates to keep the lights on there. So I get that piece of it. And then for suburban school districts and perhaps even ex-urban school districts like some that you represent, despite this hold harmless provision that's supposed to be a panacea for redistribution, you're really looking at having to go where the money is. And if it's not in Chicago and it's not in downstate schools, doesn't it necessarily mean it's in suburban and ex-urban school districts, and that's really where the money is going to come from?
Yeah, well, it's difficult to say because you got to look at the future going forward. How much more money would they put into education? But yes, I mean, essentially, all the new money that would get redistributed in that new formula is all going to come from other parts of the state, and then Chicago would get their disproportionate share, which they already receive now. And of course, folks in my area pay 3 times the property tax for a similar priced home in the Chicagoland area. So there's obviously some discrepancies there, and Chicago has gamed the system for decades, bringing more money from around the state into their failing system. And then again, you pointed out this is for a school system that's failing, doing terrible financially, and it's also lost 60,000 students over the last decade, which really begs the question of why we continue to give more money to them each and every year, and then now, under this proposal, they would get even more.
So Joe, that is the question, right? So describe for our listeners the politics of it, right? There are all these people across the state who are going to have to pay more into the system so that Chicago public schools can continue to fail out of their circumstances. So they're going to have less money for their own schools, et cetera, et cetera. And that's sort of the vast majority of the state. How does this become politically viable when so many people, the vast majority of people, the people who would vote, are going to be negatively impacted? And why, if that's the case, does it continue to happen?
Yeah, well, and you've got Speaker Madigan, who's gamed this bill to such an extent where, as you mentioned, they tied it to school funding. So if the governor doesn't sign that funding formula change, then none of the school funding gets released. And so it's all a big game. And Madigan's, basically thinks that the governor is going to blink first and have to give in to the pressure because obviously teachers, administrators, parents around the state, everybody's going to be upset if schools don't open, and then it just comes down to who is to blame. And so, unfortunately, we're back to playing games with people's lives, for no particular reason. But that's the way Speaker Madigan and President Cullerton have set up the upcoming vote and how this bill plays out.
Well, speaking of Speaker Madigan and Senate President Cullerton and how they are gaming this school funding matter, one of my most favorite parts of this whole saga is that there are no numbers associated with this bill. The Illinois State Board of Education has not produced any numbers in terms of district-by-district impact. I haven't seen any numbers from the caucuses. So you have Democrats and some surrender Republicans who voted this up without any idea on how this impacts their district. And the way they defend themselves is, well, it doesn't matter what the implications are because we have this hold harmless provision. Oh, okay. And the hold harmless just means you're not going to get less money next year and the year following than you got last year. Really? So here's the thing. You're going to bank your school's future on a politician's promise in Illinois. Have you been paying attention that they're going to have endless resources for schools in perpetuity for those schools that are actual losers, and that's the definition of redistribution, from some to others that are losers in this redistribution scheme. But the state is always going to be there forever and ever, amen, to make it up. And so I don't have to care about how my school district would actually fare if the hold harmless provision wasn't temporarily in place. That, to me, is about the biggest part of the scam and the greatest example of irresponsibility by these legislators who are supporting this and who voted for it, that they had to vote for it to at some point find out what's in it in terms of how it impacts their districts.
Well, and that's the worst part of it. It's just, essentially it's bribery from the get-go because it's all based on having more money put into it. And so the original bill before the Chicago amendment came out, they had a distribution that showed, your district will get this. Well, the only reason the districts were getting more is because we're putting more money into education overall, so everybody got a couple bucks. Now, some districts literally only got $800 to $1,000, so it's an inconsequential amount. Obviously, after the change, though, as you said, they didn't produce any of those numbers. And regardless of all that, if you put more money into any formula, you're justifying increased taxes, increased costs to the taxpayers, which is going to be spread to everybody. And so, I agree with those legislators who don't even know what's coming for their district. One thing is for sure, it's going to be more taxes taken out of their residents' pockets.
Well, exactly. That's the key. Is that here's the numbers by district without that hold harmless that you can't rely on, and then here are the property tax implications. The ISBE, in consultation with the Republican caucus, has put these numbers together, and the governor's office too. And now you've got a conversation to start with Illinois families around the state, and I hope that's something the governor does in the near term, so he can explain this latest scam that Chicago Democrats are trying to run on the state. He is State Representative Joe Sosnowski, Republican from the Rockford area and member of the Elementary and Secondary Education Committee in the House. Joe, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, guys. Have a great day.
You too.